everyone! Today we are going to be talking about the difference between compare and contrast and how we use compare and contrast inside of a reading. So for our lesson today, make sure that you have a pencil or pen, something to write with, some paper, something to write on, and your homework packet. Now you don't have to have this. If you went and picked it up from school, that's fine, but if you don't, the packet will be on the Google Classroom for you after the lesson. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our goals for today are, first off, numbers 1 and 2, to be able to identify comparisons and identify contrasts. Those are our really important differences there. We are going to figure that out by using a Venn diagram. We are going to use compare and contrast transition words. Now, we've talked a little bit about transition words in the past, but we're going to talk specifically today about those compare and contrast transition words. And lastly, how do we apply this? Number 5. We are going to find and use comparisons and contrasts in a text to help better my understanding as I read. The whole goal of becoming a better reader is to read efficiently, and compare and contrast can help us to do that. So the first thing that we want to talk about are the differences between compare and contrast. If I were to ask you to compare something, we would generally think, okay, what do I notice about these two things? But we want to be able to separate the information that comes from compare and the information that comes from contrast. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is compare. When we compare, we are looking for the similarities between two or more objects or ideas. So similarities are just how things are alike. So imagine that you are shopping for a car. When you are shopping for that car, you may compare two cars. They may have the same color, they may be the same type of car, but what you're looking for are, how are these two vehicles similar to one another? That's what you do when you compare. So what we're asking ourselves is, how are these the same? Now, on the other hand, from compare, we have contrast. So contrast asks us to look for the differences between two or more objects or ideas. So let's go back to that car that we're shopping for. I may be looking at a difference in price. I may be looking at a difference in condition. Is it new? Is it used? But what we're asking for, we are asking, how are these things different from one another? Compare and contrast are always going to be opposites for one another, and we generally see them together. We see them as a pair when we read. So we're going to look at a graphic visual that is going to help us compare and contrast a little easier. So we're going to practice together using what is called a Venn diagram. So a Venn diagram is what you see here when you have two circles that overlap one another. What we look at is we look at how one circle has things all to itself, and how the other circle has things all to itself. Where they overlap, this middle part, this is where we look at how things are the same. So we're going to look at comparing and contrasting using cash versus using credit cards. So what I would like for you to do is pause the video here and come up with a list of things that you think apply only to cash, and put them in the left side of the diagram here, and a list of things that apply only to credit cards, and put them in the right side here. Anything that applies to both gets to go in this middle circle. Okay, so you've paused your video and you've come up with your own pieces of information for cash versus credit cards. So I came up with a list too. So I started off with thinking about cash. I know that cash is convenient. I know that I can spend as much as I have with me. I can't spend more, I can't spend less. It is accepted nearly everywhere. Almost everyone accepts cash. If you only spend the cash you have, you don't have to worry about interest. It's just not something that's there. And it gives a good understanding of the total amount that you have in your accounts if you're pulling only from cash. The second thing I looked at was credit cards. So I think credit cards are convenient. I think that I can spend as much as is in my credit card limit. You know, I don't have to worry about spending only what I have with me. Some of it may come with fraud protection and credit monitoring. It may come with reward programs like cash back, and it might help you build your credit. I also know that I can only online shop with credit cards. So let's look at some things that are the same. Now, I just noticed that my first two things here, convenient, actually should be in the middle because they are both convenient. They are also both types of payment, and I also think they're easy to carry. So this visual helps me to really quickly look at the differences and the similarities so I can compare and contrast credit cards and cash. Now it's your turn. What I would like for you to do is choose one of the pairs below. So I've given you 5 pairs that you can pick from, and I want you to create a Venn diagram that helps to compare and contrast these. You're going to need them later, so make sure you give these a try. Option 1, you can compare and contrast online dating and in-person dating. Option 2, you can compare and contrast living in a city versus living in a small town. Option 3, you can compare and contrast a good boss versus a bad boss. Option 4, you can compare and contrast fruits and veggies. And option 5, you can compare and contrast movies versus books. So I'd like for you to pause the video here and create your own Venn diagram using one of the pairs below. All right, so like I said, you are going to need your Venn diagram for a little bit later. So go ahead and hold on to that. The next thing that we want to talk about are transition words. We've talked about transition words before, and we've also called them signal words because they signal to us what is happening in the text. Just like a red light always means stop, we know that certain words are always going to signal for us what is happening in a text. So we use transition words here for compare and contrast to show how things are alike or different. We use these words as guides to find out how ideas are related together. So I've come up with 2 sentences, one to show a comparison word and one to show a contrast word. So what we want to do is we want to imagine that we don't know anything about what we're reading. We can use our transition words to help act as guides so that we know how the information is related. So in my first sentence here, I have polar bears only live in the Arctic. In contrast, brown bears live all over the world. This word in contrast, this phrase here, shows me that I'm looking at a difference between 2 ideas. When I read these sentences, I notice that I am talking about polar bears and brown bears. This phrase in contrast helps me to see that those ideas are different from one another. In my second sentence, I see the heaviest polar bears and brown bears ever recorded both weighed over 2,000 pounds. So again, I'm still talking about polar bears and brown bears, but when I see this word both, what it does is it helps me to see that the information I'm talking about is a comparison. I can see that the polar bears and brown bears both share this in common, so it is a comparison. So now that we've looked at some of the differences between how we would see them in a sentence, let's look at some different transition words that we can use for compare and contrast. So I've got a really big list here, and I'm going to post this onto the Google Classroom for you so you can look at it a little more in depth. But we've got a lot of words that we see quite commonly. Words like but, however, in contrast, and nevertheless are really good contrast words. They help show us that something is different from something else. We have words like similarly, in the same fashion, in like manner, and likewise that show us what we are dealing with is something that is a comparison and not a contrast. So what I'd like for you to do is take some time and look over this list. If there are any words that you're not sure which ones they belong to, send me a message and let me know and we can talk about it. Okay, so now that we've talked about different types of transition words and which words can be used for comparison and which can be used for contrast, I want you to go back to that Venn diagram that you created where you compared and contrasted those 2 sets of words. And we're going to practice using transition words to create sentences that show comparison and contrast. So I'm going to be using my cash versus credit card. So I'm going to create one comparison sentence and one contrast sentence. So I'm going to start off with my contrast sentence, and I've decided that I'm going to use that word however. However is a really great contrast word that is very popular, and we see it in a lot of writings. So I might create the sentence that says, cash is accepted almost anywhere. However, credit cards are the only form of tender accepted online. I've contrasted cash and credit cards using that word however. Now, if I were to use a comparison word in my comparison sentence, I like the word both. So I'm going to use the sentence, both cash and credit cards are convenient to use. It tells me that those two things share that piece of information. What I'd like for you to do is pause the video and create your own comparison sentence and your own contrast sentence. All right, so you've paused the video, you've created your Venn diagrams, and you've created your comparison and contrast sentence. So let's do a little bit of practice. So my two practice problems here come from inside of the packet. So no matter where you'll do your homework, you'll see these two practice problems together. So the first type, I noticed that it's asking me two questions. Number one, what two things are being compared? And number two, what are two ways in which they're alike? So I'm going to go ahead and read the paragraph to find out. Many people have heard of killer bees, but how many of them have heard of killer ants? Killer ants, also called fire ants, are aggressive insects. Their sting can kill. Just like killer bees, the stings of fire ants can make people ill or even cause them to die. Neither insect is native to the United States. Both killer bees and fire ants come from other places. Okay, so I need to look at my questions and see what they're asking of me. We already looked at number one, and it said, what two things are being compared? I know that when I have compare, that's a word to show me how things are similar. All right, so going back to this passage, I noticed that we are talking about killer bees and fire ants. Those are the two things that are being compared, the two objects or items that I'm talking about. My second question asked me, what are two ways in which they are alike? So I need to be looking for either signal words that tell me how things are the same or just how those two things happen to be alike. So the first thing I notice is this word both. I know that both is a transition word for comparison. So both killer bees and fire ants come from other places. That's a really good way in which they are alike, so I might write that one down. Another way in that they're alike, I can say that they are both insects. Both of their stings can kill. So all three of those would fit here. I only have to choose the best two that I like. So you can choose the ones that you like as well. All right, so let's look at our second example. So this time when I look at my questions, I see what is being contrasted and what are two ways in which they're different. So our first example was looking at comparison, and our second example is looking at a contrast. Contrast is how things are different. So I'm going to be looking for any transition words that help me see that something is different. All right, so let's read it together. Over short distances, the cheetah is the fastest animal in the world. But in spite of its great speed, a cheetah cannot catch an animal that has greater endurance. Now that's a good word. What does endurance mean? I'm not quite sure, so I'm going to keep reading to see if I can figure it out. Because a cheetah cannot maintain its top speed for very long, it hunts by hiding close to a herd of animals and waiting until its prey comes close enough to attack. Okay, I think that endurance might mean that it can't maintain its speed for very long, so it can run fast, but not for very long. All right, let's keep reading. Its most common prey is the Thompson's gazelle, which can reach speeds of up to 50 miles per hour. The gazelle possesses the ability to dodge, jump over uneven ground, and endure the chase. Cheetahs are most likely to catch the young or ill gazelles, playing the predator's usual role of removing from a herd those animals that are weak or unhealthy. Okay, so I'm going to ask myself this first question. What is being contrasted? Well, I think that the things being contrasted here are cheetahs and the Thompson's gazelle. So I think that's a pretty easy one to see. So let's look at our second question. What are two ways in which they're different? All right, so I'm looking for any signal words that tell me that they are contrasted from one another. And I see this word but it's not really a contrast between those two animals, so I'm not going to use that one. So from my reading, I've learned that the Thompson's gazelle has good endurance, and the cheetah does not. So that would be a good difference that I learned from them. I also know that from a little bit later on, they use this word predator. I've also learned that a cheetah is a predator, whereas a gazelle is prey. So those are another contrast that I could add there.